Welcome to another episode of Soldier vs. Historian. Bad military memoirs, worthy of nothing but derision, do exist, though I'm the first to admit that I see the issue much differently than the average civilian military historian. In this video, I will present what I find to be an intriguing case study, and the results might just surprise you. If you are not interested in the odd military mystery, I suggest you go elsewhere. Civilian minutionistas are prone to become apoplectic at the slightest hint that a soldier might have received a little help putting clear and relevant and relatable prose to paper. These types of memoirs are not bad memoirs. They are memoirs with a little hint of military history, and the minutionistas, for their own selfish reasons, are put out by the military history and not by the genuine memories. In my view, civilian military historians only really care about soldier memories that, when taken out of context, support their academic arguments. The wider military truth of the matter is rather beside the point to minutionista historians. In my view, it is the publishing house's job to prevent the printing of any material, memoir, or history, or otherwise, that might be of questionable vintage. However, as we know, talk is cheap and bad memoirs get published just the same as bad history. I would like to examine the criteria by which I consider publications to be, quote, bad military memoirs, and then proceed to look at an example that I will label the worst military memoir in the world. Here are the criteria which, when taken together, flag a military memoir into the category of bad. The author comports themselves as exceptional. The author does not present concise lessons. The author implies, suggests, or states that their actions are not part of their character. The author lacks motivating context. The author celebrates minutia. The author relies or appears to rely on memory alone. The author either did not keep or does not have available a log or diary of the events they participated in. The author goes it alone, does not invite input from others who were there, or there are short, scattered, unrelated vignettes. There are no maps, diagrams, or tables. In my view, most, quote, bad military memoirs have redeeming qualities that are lacking in bad military histories. However, there is one standout memoir in particular that I think lacks any redeeming qualities. Looking at the criteria, what sort of military memoir do you think I might be referring to? Anything by Andy McNabb? What about Richard Marchenko? Good guesses, but no. I'm thinking of something further back in history, much further back. So far back, in fact, I'm somewhat surprised this is even still a thing. So what is the worst military memoir of all time? The Hagakure. Do not adjust your rigs. You are not seeing things. This book is a military memoir first and foremost. The Hagakure is nothing more than a conversation between two gray men. If you don't know what I mean when I say gray man, then stick around and you'll find out. I think it is notable and exceptional that both the historians, translators, William Scott Wilson and Alexander Bennett have failed to identify the Hagakure's proper literary genre as military memoir. The fact the vignettes consist of unrelated memories interspaced with assertions of the speaker's individual and at times unhinged viewpoint only reinforces the fact that this book is a memoir and nothing else, no matter the appended material. The fact that Wilson observes that the book is not, quote, a well thought out philosophy, oddly, doesn't seem to clue him in to this elephant in the room. It is clear by their introductions that both Wilson and Bennett still view the book through the novel Japanese lens of, quote, the way of the samurai. In so doing, they both fail to contend with the dual nature that this word has taken on in modern Japanese culture. They both commit the fallacy of equivocation by insisting that samurai equals warrior, while their own contextual remarks suggest that samurai equals salaryman. Wilson and Bennett's misidentification of literary genre is all the more remarkable given the fact that both Wilson and Bennett clearly understand the casual circumstances behind this. There is no other word for it, sloppy collection of bureaucratic stories uttered over top mini vessels of sake. Let's take it by the numbers. Does this particular book fulfill all the criteria for a bad memoir? The speaker and the scribe both see themselves as so-called retainers above the common soldiers. Despite the copious amounts of aphoristic wisdom on various topics, the book does not cohere under a main lesson or set of lessons. There is no explicit code as such. The book is obsessed with, quote, character, yet it does not provide a framework for actualization. Loyalty, if that is even the correct word for it, really does take on sinister connotations in the text. There is no context to this bar talk between minor government functionaries. How is this drivel relevant to, quote, warriors? The aphorisms are disjointed and unrelated. This is the heart of the definition of minutia. This minutia itself originates from the speaker's memory. The book, such that it is, has no in-text citations. The speaker and the recorder are clearly going it alone and not seeking wider contextual learning. The revered speaker has all the answers, and the book is nothing but a collection of short, scattered, unrelated vignettes. There are no maps or diagrams to highlight or clarify the speaker's sparse mention of any military ideas. I cannot think of any military memoir worse than the Hagakure. I do not think the book deserves a title that it is sold under. The book has more information on courtly etiquette than on military topics. To me, the book feels incoherent, convoluted, totemic, taking many pages and multiple vignettes to say what might otherwise be concisely stated as a single principle. Clearly, I'm not the only one who views, quote, bad military memoirs as containing redeeming qualities. There is, judging by the Amazon reviews, an indeterminate audience eager to lap up whatever redeeming qualities there are of the Hagakure. Though I hasten to add, in this particular instance, it is the historians who see the redeeming qualities of this memoir and not the soldiers. Both as a former soldier and a former martial arts practitioner, I find the Hagakure hostile towards my idea of what makes a, quote, good soldier. Leaving my opinion aside for the moment, it is impossible to read these disjointed vignettes without cherry-picking them. The text is structured in such a way that it invites this gloss, and it seems historians cannot resist leveling this failing of the text as a criticism towards their fellow historians whilst they engage in the same behavior. For me, the more interesting question is, why is the civilian military historian so fascinated by this terrible, antiquated excuse for a military memoir? In my understanding, the Hagakure meshes neatly with the civilian military historian's incorrect perception that soldiers are not human. Civilian historians, by training, are capable only of seeing warriors as either semi-divine or dead. The so-called Hagakure might be better called the backstabbing retainer's guide to the Lord's court. Historian translators, in their attempts to defend this military memoir, make unfounded claims against their perceived scholastic enemies. Alexander Bennett states in his introduction, quote, texts such as Hagakure, which advance death so matter-of-factly, shock our sensibilities, especially in an age when people have a propensity to avoid contemplating their own mortality. This specious argument, that the modern human is not the same as the past human, has always irritated me. Romanticism for the past can be a dangerous thing. Indeed, Bennett himself observes what this text represented for the Japanese during World War II. Yet somehow, he still claims that this memoir is, quote, misunderstood. I assert that Alexander Bennett has yet to recover his sensibilities. Bennett further claims that the text, quote, makes sense, and yet how the text makes sense, apart from Bennett's own summation of its historical use, he leaves to the reader. Bennett later admits that the text is still open to interpretation, thus begging the question, which is it, Professor? Does the text make sense, or is it open to interpretation? Things just don't add up. In particular, I reject the implicit claim both by Wilson and Bennett that they have, quote, contemplated the text of this memoir. The simple fact is they have not. Any reasonable person reading this memoir will start to see the obvious pattern. The memoir's aphorisms fall into a few simple, obscuous categories utterly unrelated to anything military. Courtly etiquette, consisting of the Lord's retribution, or front stabbing as I like to call it, or the peer's retribution, or backstabbing, which should be familiar to most people. Official conduct, so this is human resource matters, hiring, firing, retention, and the occasional tort, which would be an interoffice dispute or maybe a dispute with a peasant. Of course, there are matters of personal conduct. And there's the occasional brown nose. The most troubling aspect of the aphorist advice is the fact the Hagakure speaker appears to engage unspoken principle as the means for securing his own life and achieving his comfortable semi-retirement as a priest. I reject the Hagakure's spurious claim that court etiquette has anything to do with a person's will to face battle. In short, the Hagakure fails to articulate both how and why the speaker has achieved what he has achieved. Then again, what else should anyone expect from a bad military memoir? Whatever the quasi-religious meaning that this text has for Bennett, he clearly is not comfortable sharing with his readers. Instead, Bennett proffers his own cherry-picked interpretation of the text, supposedly based on, quote, the Tokugawa warrior community of honor, the samurai ethno-mentality, and to a degree local knowledge. I don't know about you, but I find Bennett's claim that he, quote, understands a foreign military culture now lost to history extremely far-fetched, and his choice of words within his claim, heaped high with qualifiers, raises still more questions. You don't have to be a simpleton to find Bennett's word choice indicative of a distracted mind. Allow me to clear the air. Let me paint this military memoir in stark terms understandable to all. The secret is that Japan doesn't actually have an outfighting warrior culture. No, what Japan has, and what is expressed at length in the Hagakure, is Japan's infighting duelist culture. Make no mistake, there's a great deal of difference between a so-called warrior and a so-called duelist. Civilian historians such as Wilson and Bennett, and even John Keegan, sadly seem unable to distinguish between these two very different military domains. They consistently cross-contaminate these two separate domains whenever it suits their academic arguments. There is a great deal of difference between the style of combat between enemies and the style of combat between, quote, friends. The speaker in the Hagakure deliberates at length on both the Japanese practice of, for lack of a better term, let's call it front stabbing, and a number of literal backstabbing incidents wherein the backstabber, by invoking the Bushido code, not only avoids punishment, but is instead showered with praise. To say what neither Wilson nor Bennett will, the Hagakure is an archaic book about how to avoid being knifed in the front by your lord or knifed in the back by your fellow samurai. Miyamoto Musashi himself leveraging this code to great effect in his famously remembered duels against many a retainer-type fellow who, it could be said, were following the Hagakure's advice. This whole gray man story of avoiding the retribution of one's peers on the one hand, whilst knifing those same gray man peers in the back with the other, is what makes for the worst kind of military memoir, no matter the age. You don't need to read any of the worst military memoirs in the world to know that you should never trust the gray man.